So now we've already done the easy one, right? We've looked at cervical vertebrae, and cervical vertebrae are pretty easy to distinguish because they have those additional holes, those additional transverse foramina, okay? The little transverse foramen right there. So 1, 2, 3 holes, cervical, easy peasy. Now, the more difficult one is to look at thoracic versus lumbar. So what we're gonna do in anatomy, it's really important that you focus on shapes, right? So we're all about describing shapes and comparing, contrasting shapes of the body part. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna distinguish these two different vertebrae regions based on shapes, starting with the body. Okay, so this right here, this is a thoracic vertebrae, and we look at the body. Remember, this is the body here. The body of the thoracic vertebrae is going to create what to me looks a lot like a nice heart shape. And pay particular attention to the fact that it's fairly narrow along it. Okay, so there is a nice heart-shaped body of a thoracic vertebrae. Whereas the shape of the lumbar, yes, it has a little bit of a dip, but it's much more broad. And to me, it makes much more of an oval shape. Okay, so if it's narrow, that's going to be thoracic, and if it's broad, that's going to be lumbar. Thoracic, lumbar. Now, why? Why do you think the lumbar is going to have a bigger body, a broader body? Okay, a bigger and broader body. It has to do with the fact that the further you go down, the more weight is being put upon it. Right? So this lumbar vertebrae has to hold a lot of weight, a lot of compressed weight pushing down on it. And so that it's going to require a much bigger, broader body. Okay, so it's more weight bearing than the thoracic one. Okay, and you'll notice as we go down, look at the size of the cervical, much smaller. Okay, so that's one thing to look at. You have a heart shape, kind of narrow. You got more of a rounder, kind of broader oval shape. That's lumbar. The next one is the vertebral foramen. Okay, so when you look at the vertebral foramen, remember that's the big hole in the vertebrae. For the thoracic, that creates a circular structure. Okay, so we got a nice circular hole in the middle. That's going to indicate thoracic. Whereas when we look at the lumbar, here's lumbar, that creates more of a triangular shape. Okay, so when you compare the two, the thoracic vertebrae will have a round vertebral foramen, and the lumbar vertebrae will have a triangular vertebral foramen. Okay, that's the second one. The third one we're going to look at is the shape of the spinous process. Okay. For the thoracic, the spinous process, which is this one, is going to be hooked downward. Okay, so it's going to be pointy and it's going to go downward. That is going to be thoracic vertebrae. Whereas when you look at the spinous process of the lumbar vertebrae, it kind of sticks out straight and it's much more square. Not perfectly, because we're not, robots, but yes, much more square shape. That's going to be the lumbar vertebrae. Look at the difference. Okay, so I chose ones that had a pretty distinctive difference. You have a pointy one that points down, and one that goes right out, and it has more of a square shape to it. Okay, so thoracic, lumbar. Now, the other thing is you can look at the thoracic one, and on the transverse process, you're going to find these little facets. Do you remember what a facet is? It's just a shallow, kind of smooth region, and that's for articulations. So what do you think is going to articulate right there? The ribs. Are you going to find any rib articulations on the lumbar? No, why not? It doesn't articulate with the lumbar. So you're only going to have rib articulations in the thoracic region because you only have ribs in the thoracic region. You don't have any ribs in the cervical or the lumbar region. Okay, so facets for rib articulations are only going to be found on the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so a quick word of caution. As you get closer to the boundary between the two, they kind of start looking closer and closer to each other. So for example, this is the 12th thoracic vertebrae, and it looks a little bit like a lumbar vertebrae. So what you would want to do is want to look at multiple different bone features. But for the online version of this class, we're not going to show you probably multiple different orientations. And so we would, of course, choose pictures that are very distinctive and characteristic of a typical vertebrae from that region. Okay, so don't worry, I'm not going to try to trick you, but I do want you to be aware that sometimes you have multiple big pieces there. Okay, so now we need to go in and talk about the thoracic cage, and so I'm going to stop it and we're going to make a separate video on that.